Now, very often what was supposed to be an estimated 3-month transfer process of a residential property can end up being delayed by months, and buyers and sellers can wait 6 months to a year for a property to transfer. But what if you are the innocent party during such a delay? Can you exit the transaction without consequence? Or are you tied into an agreement with no end in sight? Well, to shed light on the matter, I'm now joined by Matthew Ainsworth, Senior Associate at HBG Schindlers Attorneys. Matthew, welcome to All About Property.
Thank you, Cornelius.
Now we're talking about delays, and I've got a couple of scenarios here which are all real-life delays. And the first one I want to chat to you about is buyer finance. Buyer finance is a suspensive condition, and when it's declined, then the deal lapses. But what if the bank is taking its time to get back to the buyer, even after an extension has been granted? Can the buyer or seller say, that's it, I'm out?
No. So generally the safest bet is to wait for that time period to lapse and don't extend another extension. Generally, in these scenarios, most sale agreements have what's called a continued marketing clause, which is the safest bet for your seller, in which case they can essentially have their cake and eat it too. They can have a sale agreement that's still running in that point in time, which is still suspensive until that bond or finance is obviously granted, whilst at the same time they can still have their property on the market. Should another sale agreement come through, another offer to purchase that is perhaps not suspensive, which is the key component here, they can, depending on the content of their continued marketing clause, give notice to their first purchaser, the one waiting for finance, to say, listen, you've got 48 hours, 72 hours, whatever it is, to either waive your suspensive condition or fulfill it. Failing which, your agreement's going to fall away and I'm going to continue with my other agreement.
So I guess the key here is make sure that the offer to purchase has a continued marketing clause.
In this instance, yes, absolutely. Sometimes it does make some purchasers nervous, but in that conversation, your seller needs to stand strong and needs to say, listen, if you are so certain that you're going to get what you're going to get, then that's fine. If you're not certain, then that's also a conversation you need to have.
So what if the delay is caused by either the purchaser or the seller? Let me give you some examples. Let's say the purchaser is deliberately taking his time to sign the quote from the bank, so the bank can't issue guarantees. Or the seller is just not getting around to do all the compliance certificates. What happens in an instance like that?
Okay, so for example, in your second scenario, we're going to act on the assumption that, say, the bond finance has been granted or it's a cash deal. So it's a fully enforceable agreement at that point. The best case there would be if your agreement says that the seller is supposed to provide compliance certificates, say, on demand or on request or on advice from the conveyancers or the agents, and they're not doing so despite having been requested or demanded to do so, then the purchaser can place the seller in breach. And then depending on the time period in the breach clause of the agreement, normally it's 7 or 10 days, sometimes working, sometimes calendar, it depends on the wording. Once that breach period lapses after notice, then the purchaser in that instance has the remedies available to them to normally either cancel, claim specific performance, possibly even damages, which actually have to have been suffered in those instances. In the first scenario, with regards to the seller, the purchaser not signing the quotation, etc., again, usually dependent on the way the agreement is structured. Most agreements have a clause that says that the purchaser is supposed to do all things necessary or required of them to obtain finance, which is like supply the documents, sign the quotes, do all things that the bond originator or the bank requires them to do. So if they fail to do that, and at that point the agreement still is suspensive, say hasn't been made fulfilled just yet, then the breach is slightly different in that, and this is the conversation the sellers need to have with their attorney, the conveyancers as well as the agent, because essentially they just can again wait for that period to lapse and say, well, listen, you haven't signed your quote, you didn't get bond finance as contemplated in the agreement's over, cheers, have a good life kind of thing. But if the seller, is adamant that they kind of want them to hold, then you enter the realm of fictional fulfillment, which is a tough road to follow.
What is fictional fulfillment?
So in a nutshell, it's essentially where the seller holds the purchaser to the agreement as though they did fulfill their suspensive conditions. Okay, but what it does is, just as it's trying to lock the purchaser in, it also locks the seller in. So essentially, the purchaser gets advised in writing, listen, if you haven't complied by whatsoever date that you need to have complied by, you will be deemed to have complied, and the repercussions of the agreement will follow. And then normally then, say for example, the agreement says guarantees have to be supplied within 20 or 15 days after bond grant. That seller now has to wait those 15 days for those guarantees, which in this case, say, perhaps don't ever land because the purchaser is not ever going to actually entertain the bond, and then can only place the purchaser in breach. So it's creating a time frame extension for themselves. And during that time, any continued marketing clause wouldn't apply, because those normally apply when the agreement is still suspensive. Now you're holding it out as though the agreement is not suspensive.
Can the seller say, this is it, no more, I'm cancelling the deal without consequence?
Once they get, if that, for example, in the bond quotation part, if it's still suspensive, and they hit that, say, the 15 days to get a bond, the guy hasn't signed the bond, he hasn't therefore fulfilled the suspensive condition, then then the agreement would lapse. And then it's not so much a cancel, it's so much like it's done. It lapses exhaustively on the midnight stroke of the bell kind of thing of that last day.
So, Matthew, here's my next question. Let's say, for instance, halfway through the transfer process, the buyer discovers a latent defect. The seller was not aware of this latent defect. The buyer is now saying, sorry, I'm not carrying on with the transfer until the seller fixes this defect. The seller's going, no ways. There was no due diligence clause in the contract. And you bought this property, foots to it. So now there's a back and forth between the buyer and the seller. It's getting delayed. Can one of the parties say, I'm out of here without consequence?
So again, using the wording of the contract that you mentioned in that instance, if, for example, now the purchaser, say, still hasn't paid their transfer costs, they're like, you know what, I'm not proceeding, I'm not doing anything more, I'm not coming in to sign documents, nothing until the seller fixes this wall, for example, then that is technically a breach of your contractual obligation, because 90% of contracts will say purchaser is supposed to come in, seller and purchaser come in on demand of on request of the conveyancers to sign transfer documents, do all things necessary to effect the transfer, pay costs on demand, all those kinds of things. So it's not always wise to simply just say, listen, until you fix it, sorry, because it can have an impact on your contractual obligations, which then falls back into that realm of a breach, which would allow, say the purchaser is the one refusing to now proceed and is not doing what they're supposed to do. The seller, as an external thing to this questions of latent and patent defects, and say, listen, regardless of what you're trying to say, you're not doing what you're supposed to. Contractually, there is no obligation on me to now say, fix this thing. I'm going to place you in breach, and if you don't do what you're supposed to do, pay what you're supposed to do, I'm out of here, kind of thing. And then possibility of damages and stuff can follow from there. But often it's a lot the safer bet here, because inevitably both parties are going to want what they want. And what we normally recommend is either through us as the conveyancers or through the agents, negotiate. Get somewhere that's a middle line, in the sense of, I don't know about the wall, or I don't know about the tap leak or something like that. Either that means rather, instead of I'm going to take it out of my pocket, maybe we drop the purchase price a little bit, or it's a case of, you know what, I'll cover half, you take the other half of it, or send me some quotes. And the best way is to try to find a middle ground before you go all the way to that, you know what, the gloves are off, let's just place you in breach for not doing what you're supposed to do, and take it from there.
I love it. Matthew, thank you so much for all your insights. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.